everyone, I'm Richard Parfitt, the Marketing Director at iVentiv. So far this year, iVentiv has run 4 executive knowledge exchanges for global leaders in L&D in Paris, Atlanta, New York, and London. So we thought now would be a good time with that global footprint established for 2026 to sit down and look at some of the key themes, talk about some of the key themes that we have been hearing so far at our event and in the wider conversations that we've been having with global heads of learning and development. So many of you watched and listened to the 2026 predictions video that we did earlier this year that I have been able to twist the arms of Hannah and Kristy to join me again for today's conversation. So I'm joined to introduce them formally by Kristy Kitson, our L&D Strategist, and by Hannah Hoey, our Content Director. Very glad to have you both with us. Thank you for joining me and for indulging me once again. And between you, you've either attended, facilitated, or built the agenda for all 4 of the events that we've had this year, and for our 5th event of the year next week in Cologne at time of recording. So looking forward to hearing your thoughts, your key takeaways so far. And we're going to do a little assessment of the predictions that we made for 2026 as well, and see how we think we're doing so far. I'm a bit nervous about mine, but we'll come to that. So just to kick us off, let's say you've both been at events already this year. So I just want to ask what the most common theme is that you've heard so far. And we didn't actually decide who was going first, but I'm looking at Hannah. So we'll start with Hannah.
So I would say just from being at the events, but also not only in conversations with those that are facilitating at the sessions, but working closely with our event chairs, our hosts, that often bringing in people from outside of the HR business, and with our partners. So I've been talking with people that are not necessarily in the L&D role a lot. And so the political and macro environment is having a huge influence on conversations. It's sort of taking over any other, in the sense of, well, we'd love to do this, we'd love to do that, but we need to wait and see. But we're just navigating current instability or current changes. And so I think it's been a real kind of pivot back to leadership thinking, which is always the case at iVentiv. We're always talking about leadership, but definitely, leaders under pressure. And I've seen a bit of a rise of the R word again, which came through a lot in 2020. But that's resilience, and how are we both preparing our leaders for the future, but also how are we looking after them now, and also looking back, like how important it is still to have strategic thinkers that can think around certain problems in times of uncertainty.
Yeah, and that's interesting. So was looking at the top priorities that we've seen on our pre-event questionnaires so far this year. Before we came on to record, I wrote them down because I was never going to memorize them. But change management, as we saw last year, being one of the top priorities, again, one of the top 5 so far this year, and that's very much reflected in what you're saying. Has that been even across the world? Europe, UK, US?
Yeah, I would say so. And also it's the conversations are changing week on week. And what I'm finding a lot is the conversations they're planning for multiple different scenarios, multiple different futures. And that's not just with the wider environment that we're working in, but also within how AI is being implemented, if they follow the skills conversation. So yeah, it's definitely across the board.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's what's really kind of taken over conversations before, during, and after exchanges. Unsurprisingly, it's the macroeconomic and socio-political climate. But what's really struck me about conversations at the actual exchanges itself, so I was lucky enough to be at Paris, which was technically our first event, and in London just a couple of weeks ago, is that it's not necessarily what people are focusing on, it's more like, how are we going to make it happen? That's what the conversation sounds like when you're in the room. It's how seriously we're taking implementation. So if you look at, like, for example, AI, leadership, culture, they've all been, the perennial issues, but the conversations have shifted very much from this should we to, okay, how can we, how will we, and at scale. That's what I think. But it is in a challenging environment in which people are having these conversations, and I think that's important to kind of acknowledge.
Yeah, and to come on to AI, I think that was going to be your dominant theme that you've been hearing about.
Yeah. So I mean, if we take AI as an example, so and I think it's unsurprising that learning leaders are talking about AI because they've been through a lot of the disruption already early on. Because if we think about the impact that AI had on learning, it was very kind of early doors. It can create content, it can personalize at scale, it can do all of these things. So I think learning leaders have already gone through that disruption. So they're really now positioning themselves to how people apply those learnings to the organization as a whole, which I think is a really interesting position to be in at this moment in time.
Okay, that's really interesting, and I think brings us on to my second question for you both, which was going to be the biggest point of disagreement. And we talk about change and technological change, geopolitical change, all the things that learning teams and businesses more broadly are dealing with. But maybe Kristy, I can start with you for this one, because I think what you want to talk about ties in quite nicely.
It definitely does. So if you take the example of AI, it's the biggest point of disagreement hasn't been what's important, it's who owns the transformation. Like, it's really clear that transformation is needed in every sector of the business because of the external environment. But with AI, for example, and I think I talked about this at the end of last year as well, there was that tussle between, does L&D or does IT take responsibility for the rollout of AI across the organization? I think that has changed and evolved slightly in a way that I think a lot of learning teams were hoping that it would, in that in some organizations now, learning is being looked to as the experts that are going to kind of make it happen, where, the rubber meets the road kind of thing, and really make sure that it's embedded through workflows. But then that throws up a whole other interesting challenge in terms of how are you measuring that, and how are you, what impact does that have on? We always talk about, learning successes being measured as business impact, and AI is a really interesting moment to consider that, because it's, so different from organization to organization and within different contexts. But I think it really is interesting that learning are stepping into that role in really enabling the adoption. And actually, in London, a couple of weeks ago, our first question for our collaborative cafe was, how is learning enabling the uptake of AI across the organization? And there was some pushback, and someone said, well, should it not be drive? And some people said, well, I wish we were driving it, but we're not. And this is my organizational context. And so it's, I think it's not necessarily everyone agrees what's important, but it's like, how are we making that happen? Or who's responsible, who's taking ownership is where I've seen some disagreement in conversation.
I would say my take was also that there is agreement of where organizations need to go. But the disagreement is how much is actually working in practice, and how much is actually changing in practice. And there are people that are at different stages, but also people that have different frustrations. A lot of hang-ups about, well, we're spending too much time thinking about the language and the messaging rather than just the doing. Or we're getting distracted by shiny objects when we actually just need to get the implementation in, the foothold strong. And so that's the kind of the point of differentiation that I'm seeing in the discussions.
And that's come up on a lot of the interviews that we've done so far this year, the shiny object challenge, particularly that learning teams and learning leaders are desperate to show that they're getting ahead with AI, and so might be going for the most attractive AI product that they see in front of them, as opposed to looking at it from a strategic business level kind of lens. I'm sorry, was that your point of disagreement that you wanted to raise as well? Or is that,
just that there's an agreement on where organizations need to be going. The disagreement is how much is actually working, or how much is actually making a difference and a measurable impact. And the conversation always comes back to we always want to be proactive, not reactive. And I think sometimes there might just be a moment of like, let's call a spade a spade. Some of it is going to be reactive, right? It is going to be reactive to how the business is changing and the strategy, and rather get frustrated with that, but kind of almost lean into it and understand where are the pockets that can be proactive, and prove that, and also understand that there will be still elements that are reactive to how things are changing, and understanding that those two things might need to be measured differently, or that they will naturally be taken at different streams.
And is this a problem? Not a problem. Is this a challenge that's coming from the way that learning teams are approaching it, or from the nature of the technology itself when it comes to AI? Because there's a lot of room for false promise with some of these new technologies. And is it that the L&D teams are having trouble with how they're implementing things, or is it that they're kind of doing everything right and the technology doesn't live up to the promise?
If I can offer a lens on that, I think there's the expectation versus reality piece. I think it's complicated by what you said initially in terms of the external environment. Change is happening there at such a pace that, things need to move quickly, and perhaps things aren't moving quickly enough, and that's the problem. But even if you take something that's not technology based, so the skills question, right, which we talked about before, there's there's what we hope it will deliver and what it ends up delivering, but it's not necessarily. I think skills is where something like this gets interesting, because it's not whether skills matter. Everyone's aligned that skills matter. It's it's how is it embedded, and we have the privilege of talking to people from really complex matrixed organizations, and I think it's the complexity piece that is the issue, in terms of, you can, with AI, with skills or something, you can promise something that will work in one area that won't necessarily translate across the business or across different geographical contexts. I don't know if that begins to answer your question at all.
Yeah.
But I think complexity is the issue from my perspective, I see.
And I think you're taking a minute to reflect. The way that I'm interpreting it is, and I hadn't thought of it in this way before, but actually learning by its very nature is acknowledging that there is a gap. Right? It's not just, okay, everyone already knows this, so we're gonna talk about it again. No, learning is, there is a gap there, and we need to address that. And so perhaps it's about not being afraid that there is a gap. The reason why there's a gap is why we need learning. So when those things do fall down, it's not being too harsh and saying, this was, we picked the wrong priority, but priorities will shift and change. People are also taking up AI in their own lives, and personal capability is advancing. So I think it's actually something that we are still exploring. Well, we have definitely moved more towards implementation at an organizational level. I think there will always be those challenges of, something else has come up, or this is the lay of the land has changed. The tech didn't integrate in the same way that we thought we did. Actually, we've realized that that's not what we were trying to solve for. But that just means that there will always be another case for learning, right? Because then you need to learn and pivot and change. So by its very nature, that's the way things go.
Yeah, and just talking about the topics you guys have raised, I think we talk about the dominant themes so far. Really, it sounds like we're seeing a lot of the same themes evolving and continuing from 2025. So the top 4 topics that our participants have chosen on their PEQs as being their top priorities are AI, leadership, learning culture, and reskilling and upskilling, which is in a very slightly different order the same top 4 that we saw last year. So it does seem like there's a lot of consistency in the conversation. But maybe I can ask you, outside of that, which is perhaps not very surprising, what has surprised you the most about Sabbath?
So one of the biggest surprises I think that we've seen from a purely data perspective is there's been jumps in topics that are traditionally been slower movers or very small margins of deviation. Content libraries, I believe, from 17 up to 27, which vastly shifts where it sits on priorities, and same as LXPs. Now, we talk a lot about whether it's methodology, whether it's timing. Is it that 5-year strategy or 5-year contracts are sunsetting so people are naturally thinking about it? And so we are probably hypercritical on whether it's actually indicative of the way that things are going, or whether it's a reporting. Are we influenced by the regions that we're in? But I do think it still is interesting to see that uptick, and I think it's less, especially because they're topics that people have maybe the more cynical people are saying, well, AI will do all of that. And what we're looking at is, well, maybe what we've realized, and maybe to your first question, is AI can't do all of that or shouldn't do all of that. And also maybe we need to look at integrating it in a different way. And there's a few other things that have jumped up, which suggests learning leaders are returning to look at the learner experience, and not just the tech that they're implementing, but actually how are the users' experiences, how are they engaging it, how are we able to measure it? But those kind of jumps are interesting, and I think obviously we'll still need to see throughout the year how much that actually does reflect. But it is interesting, at least.
But are you hearing that play out in the conversations as well? How is that manifesting?
Well, so for example, the thing that's, and I can't say it surprised me, because I have an enduring kind of faith in the learning community, but what I'm really happy to see is, in spite of the complexity of the situations that a lot of our people are working in, and things that they're dealing with, they're ready for it. Like they're kind of ahead of the curve with some stuff. And I think, so again, to go back to the AI example, so learning teams have been through AI disruption themselves in like microcosm. They've been confronted with, this is going to change. It means this for your team and that for your team. And so because of that, they're kind of ready to take on the challenges of where things are difficult and fail fast and do all of those things. So I think I think they're not overwhelmed in a lot of senses. They're kind of ahead of the curve. And I think linking to what you were saying about they're talking about learner experiences now. I think a lot of people, and we're hearing this with our facilitators and in conversation at our events, people are really focusing on the human now. Mm-hmm. They're like, our humans are how work gets done. Our leaders need to be preparing them. And we've had some fascinating conversations focusing on learner experience, employee experience. And I think it's really interesting to see how that's starting to affect how they're responding to these.
Mm-hmm. And what differentiates a truly human experience versus not, and what needs to stay there, or what, when we say needs to stay there, I'm conscious these words have a lot of weight now, and they always are like, oh, this won't be human in future, and it might not be, but I mean, we're still going to be here. So like, I think let's think positively about trying to find a place. Sometimes I think the conversation is like, well, AI is going to do all of that, and it's all of that. Like, can we like think actively about how we want to be, what we want our jobs and our roles to look like, and work towards that, like rather than a purely like almost race to the bottom of how much can we automate. I think there's a lot of optimism in the conversation, which maybe wasn't the case before.
I think learning leaders are really treading the path between, they're really intentional in two things. One is the employee experience and focusing on the human, but the other is meeting business needs. So they are walking that line really intentionally. And I think that's something that's been, I don't know if it's surprising, but it is really interesting to see and hear the conversations and hear the kind of detail that they will go in as to how they do that, how they meet, business metrics, and how they. There's a lot of talk at the moment about retaining talent rather than sourcing new talent, and that reskilling and upskilling piece, of course, has always been there. And I think how how intentional learning leaders are in that space is really great to hear.
One of the questions that was asked in New York was just very simply put, but it's like, well, can we really afford not to learn? Which was a challenge to when they're like, well, AI does that. And they're like, well, that's fine, but we still can't afford to not develop people and not advance, or at least try and advance. And also there's some very basic levels of, well, we need to make sure that people are updated on their risk and compliance training or anything. There's things that will always need to be assessed and also need, pay lip service to. But also, like, we should want people to learn and develop or reskill or upskill. That should be that should have intrinsic value, I think. As well.
AI is never going to be so good that you want your people to get dumber.
No, exactly. There was actually quite a lot of talk on the pre-event call before Cologne and Copenhagen. Obviously, Cologne, at time of recording, being next week, and they were talking about really being getting ahead of the atrophy, like the mental atrophy that can happen as a result of AI, and saying, well, we know we don't want that within our workforce. So what are we doing about that now? Which I think was a really interesting thing to hear, acknowledged at scale. What's surprising me the most, or not necessarily surprising me the most, but what's interesting to me really is the confidence and the maturity of learning leaders and their learning teams, because of the change and disruption that they've already been through, and how ready they are to get ahead of that with the wider workforce.
We did make some predictions at the start of the year, and in case you've forgotten them, I've written them down, or a short summary of them. So I just want to get your assessment on how you think your prediction is playing out so far this year, and we will do mine as well for full disclosure. So Kristy, your prediction was that L&D would be getting more involved in the organizational design and the organizational excellence space. We have stats for you around this because we added organizational development as one of the options on our pre-event questionnaires, and so far this year 24% of heads of L&D who are attending our events have selected that as a priority, which does put it just inside the top 10 topics for the year. So how do you feel about your prediction?
I'm glad that it's on there, and I'm pleased to see people selecting it. I think, if I'm being completely honest, directionally, I think I might have been there might have been some merit in it, but I think it's happening slower or at a smaller scale than I initially predicted because of the kind of volatility of the external environment. So I think it's one of those things where you want to be proactive versus reactive, and there's only such an extent that you can do that when there's no sort of, when the business isn't setting long-term goals. It's you have to be realistic about what there is. But what I am enjoying seeing is learning being looked to as the people development experts. I do think that is bearing out. The business is increasingly turning to learning and saying, okay, well, how do we make this happen? So yeah, directionally, I think some merit in it, but not really in terms of speed and pace, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, so Hannah may want to come in on this as well, especially I'm going to reference an interview that you did with Charles and Chu ahead of our event in Copenhagen coming up this month. But there was a survey by Boston Consulting Group of CHROs asking about their top priorities, and I noticed organizational design and development is one of the top priorities for CHROs as well. And then when I think of that really good interview that Hannah did with Charles and Chu ahead of the Copenhagen event, where they were talking about what they call atomic teams and making the team the unit of performance by which you think about the organization. That seems like learning going into a very much how work gets done kind of question, rather than a what things do people learn. So I would say that this prediction's doing quite well.
I think that's true in terms of, it's becoming less about delivering learning and more about designing how organizations adapt and perform, I think, in general.
And I would say as well, just to caveat the data, is our community isn't just global heads of learning. We also have global heads of talent and global heads of leadership. And we do have designated sessions that answer to that. Our first specifically talent session is coming up in May. And I think that will swing the data considerably, as it would normally sit within them. Even just today, I've had a conversation with someone whose role has changed to become an enterprise head of talent. And she's like, I'm not looking at in the business units, I'm looking overall, how are we designing that? And she's like, it's linking a lot closer to strategic workforce planning. And so I think, looking at our community, the call to put that in was from that wider community. And once we've got more of that data, I do imagine that would tick up.
Yeah. Okay. But we're giving a reasonable thumbs up to that prediction.
I will take it.
So then, Hannah, yours was that the AI conversation is going to be more about what we should be doing with AI rather than what we are doing with AI, with L&D more involved in AI governance. And I think we've covered a fair amount of that already, but what are your reflections on?
And it's hard when we're having these conversations, not just to say what I would like it to be and what it actually is. But to Kristy's point as well, I do think, not to sit on the fence, but I do think it is too early to tell really how they're playing out, because it is a more unstable environment, or there are other priorities that have just competed for the conversation this year. So if I'm reflecting purely on the data that I have in front of me and the conversations that I've had, other conversations have taken up. But all that is to say, actually, I think the conversation of AI governance has entered into the public sphere a lot more. We've seen that in conversations I'm having outside of work. We're seeing that. So I do anticipate that to still play a part. Whether L&D has a major part in that, I would like that to happen. And I'd like to see that. But I know we talked a lot about digital twins and what that's going to look like. But it's moving so fast. I wonder if that would, and predicting anything about AI would already be redundant by January on that. So yeah.
Okay. But Kristy, you were talking earlier about this question of what we are doing versus what we should be doing with AI, and so how have you heard that manifest at the event?
So I think, the more that we hear about AI, and I think you're right, it's difficult to be decisive on it on any given moment because of the nature of the beast. But I think the more we hear about it, the more it becomes clear that it's not a technology shift, it's an organizational shift, regardless of what that change is, regardless of what the uptake is. It's not
a societal one even.
Society,
it's changing everything. Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay. Well, then my prediction was that skills-based approaches and skills-based organizations would become a kind of accepted orthodoxy rather than the latest new thing. I'm less optimistic about my prediction than yours. So skills is down as a top priority from 55% to 51%. Relatively small sample so far, so that could just be margin of error. There may not really be any movement there. But then,
Well, I would challenge it also supports your case that it is becoming less of a priority because it's becoming an accepted orthodoxy.
yeah, that's true.
It's not something that people need to action as much anymore.
Maybe that's it. But then there've been 2 of the interviews that I've recorded for our Insight series this year, where the person I'm interviewing has said that they think there's a bit of shiny object syndrome with the skills.
I can add a third to that mix as well. I've had that conversation as well. Yeah.
So I think you spoke to Nikhil Sharma, who was one of those to say that we might be getting a bit too obsessed with the sort of skills conversation. And it's early days; these things are still in motion. And like you say, perhaps the sign of it becoming accepted orthodoxy is that it stops being a hot topic that people are talking about.
Well, and I think, not to put any words in people's mouths, but it was that conversation that we touched on earlier, which is this getting hung up on the language rather than the actual impact. And not to spend so long talking about it that you're actually not looking at the measurable difference that it makes. I think the conversation I've heard from people is, okay, we've done all the hard work of moving to be SBO, and now what? So now what are we doing with that data? How is it true? How are we truly leveraging it to make better decisions, to preempt these decisions, to understand our people better, to understand more broadly what what population is looking like. So it's kind of the what now, rather than the how.
Yeah, I also think there's been some talk that maybe it's not able to move fast enough because, to the point about the external environment and internal environment shifting so quickly. I mean, I had a conversation even as far back as a couple of years ago where someone had said that they'd begun down the road to becoming a skills-based organization. They'd paused and they'd rolled back because they hadn't defined the problem that they were trying to solve by becoming skills-based before they did it. I think we're just seeing that a lot more now because everything is changing so quickly. It's almost like if we could have become skills-based ahead of all of this change, we would have the agility now within workforce planning and things like that. I think I don't know, I might be wrong, but I wonder if there's kind of the kind of bolting the gate after
shut the gate
after the horse bolted kind of thing potentially going on. I'm not sure.
And don't get me wrong, my feeling is that skills are just the accepted language now, and that it needs to be the accepted language and less of the shiny object or it's a priority. It just has to be the way that you talk about things.
Well, we talked ourselves into feeling optimistic about all of our predictions, so that's good. Good mutual support as a team there. But look, thank you both for sharing the insights from the events so far this year. We've got plenty more for the rest of the year. You can find those at iventiv.com/events if you want to sign up for those. But again, thank you both, and we'll probably get back together again in a couple of months' time and hear about the conversations over late spring, early summer, and see where we are at mid-year, and then see how the conversation develops.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard.